Kerbal Space program is dead.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
No, it isn't. And you know what's even worse? The fact that it was murdered. I'm actually not completely joking because as I was researching my last video, I noticed a couple of things that made me do a bit of a double take. A bit of a huh? A bit of a whoop? A bit of a For those of you who haven't taken a business class before, this little chart is called a product life cycle diagram. It represents the usually 4 standard phases that most goods and services go through. Everything from introduction to growth to maturity, and then finally, a slow and painful decline into irrelevance. However, every product is not doomed to slide into nothingness. There is the other phase that might happen, a so-called reinvention, where the smart people innovate and make the product relevant again. A good example of reinvention is Netflix. In 2021, they seemed pretty screwed. Disney Plus, HBO Max, Peacock, and Paramount Plus were all munching away at their market share. Their stock price was falling and it looked like their downward spiral had begun. But then, Netflix announced I wasn't allowed to use my brother's, friends', uncle's, barber's, dog's password so I could watch the hit show All Hail King Julian. And boom! Stock price coming back up and business saved. Reinvention. I think Take-Two wanted to do the same with Kerbal. The earliest versions of KSP-1 were released all the way back in 2011. I bet that's even before some of you watching this video were born. So, it's not exactly a new game. I mean, more experienced players have pretty much maxed out the abilities of KSP-1 years ago. Speaking personally, I can think of at least several video ideas that I had to scrap because of Kraken or lag issues. Therefore, to keep the game alive and the community engaged, a sequel seemed like a no-brainer. However, what wasn't included in that calculation was the possibility of the sequel absolutely sucking! I know there are people who still defend KSP2, and if you are one of those people, just ask yourself, when's the last time you actually played the game? For me, that was about 1 week after the launch. Let's face it, KSP2 is an unfinished, buggy, laggy disaster. It is just not a fun game, unfortunately. I showed this graph in my last video. This shows the number of people playing KSP2 on Steam. During its release, it managed to rack up a pretty impressive 11,812 concurrent players. But since then, it's been nothing but down. As of recording, at best, there's like 200 to 300 people playing KSP2 at any given time. In just 9 months, KSP2 has lost over 99.9% of its players. Dead and buried. Okay, that's great. But what does this have to do with KSP1? Well, it seems that KSP2's death spiral was not exactly a victimless crime. This is the concurrent player graph for KSP1. Right here is when KSP2 was released. What happened is pretty obvious. It was averaging about 4,000 to 5,000 players before KSP2 came out. Then after, it pretty much halved to around 2,500. Well, that's just Steam. There's still plenty of people who bought the game directly through the publisher. They're probably playing it a lot more. While I wish that were true, I do believe I have some evidence to conclusively prove that the franchise of KSP is on its deathbed, which is not, something I wanted to say. First, let's have a look at Google Trends, and if we overlay the Steam charts onto that, oh yeah. Same goes for YouTube searches. And speaking of YouTube, this is the Social Blade statistics for Matt Lown. I chose to use Matt as an example because he's pretty much one of the only channels that was consistently posting content on KSP, both before and after the launch of the second game, and was doing so at a roughly equivalent frequency. Alright, so let's have a look here. Oh, it's kind of the same story, isn't it? If you take a look at our little diagram thingy again and map the life of Kerbal Space Program onto it, I'm talking about the franchise as a whole, not just one or the other game, but it would probably look something like this. Everything is looking pretty normal for the first while, then all of a sudden, boom! This is why I say it was murdered. Because left to its own devices, I am almost certain KSP would be in a much better state than it currently is. It really seems like the release of KSP2 was such a disaster that it took down both games and the entire franchise by extension. Well, why should I care? KSP is a single player game after all. It's not like my enjoyment of the game is going to change depending on how many other people are playing it. I actually think it's a pretty valid viewpoint. But how about I share my opinion real quick and we'll see if anyone agrees or not. So, a bit of background first. I started playing KSP back in 2016, pretty much at the peak of the game's popularity. Getting KSP was actually kind of like a flex at school for me, which kind of shows the people I was hanging out with in middle school. So, while I have been playing the game for around 7 years, it wasn't until fall of 2020 when I started this channel that I actually became really involved in the community. After making videos for a few months, I really started to see some relative success in early 2021, with it ultimately peaking between March and May of that year. And as much as I would like to think that I was just making a ton of good videos, just absolute banger after banger during that period, there may possibly, on the off chance, 1-2% probability that there may have been something else happening during that time period, but I can't seem to quite remember what exactly it was.
I don't know what the hell y'all talking about.
After a couple years of off and on uploading, we eventually arrive in 2023. After the failure of KSP2, I think I pretty rightly assumed that there was no future left for Kerbal Space Program. And as I've been contemplating coming back to YouTube for the last month or so, I was honestly leaning toward the idea of just burying this channel and starting completely fresh in a totally separate genre. But then I got to thinking about all the stuff we did during the life of the Pilot 1549 channel. Stuff like our community space station, hosting races and multiplayer, the Starship Landing Challenge, and of course, the time you guys made me stream for like 4 days straight nonstop. That was fun. Thinking back on this stuff, I realized something. It was pretty fun. Despite occasional drama, I think the KSP community is pretty awesome, and I think there's still so much potential to be unlocked from both the players and the game of Kerbal Space Program. And also, I think a franchise as impactful as KSP deserves more than just to be another victim of the sell now finish later epidemic that's already taken up so many games already. So, why don't we do something? If Take-Two can't reinvent KSP, then, how about we do it?